Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the John Adams Institute, and a special welcome to our John Adams members, family, friends, associates, and sponsors. We have a very large contingent of folks here with us tonight from our corporate members, PwC, and it is a pleasure to have you all with us tonight in the wonderful Pakhuis de Zwijger. My name is Ian Kenny, and I'm the Program and Development Coordinator here at the John Adams Institute. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight for what promises to be a thought-provoking and timely conversation, one that in many ways, for our planet, for our societies, is long overdue. We are thrilled to be joined by environmental economist Jisung Park, here to talk about his new book, Slow Burn. And in it, he asks a crucial question. What if the most profound effects of climate change are not the floods or the wildfires or hurricanes, but the slow, invisible shifts that seep into our daily lives and into our institutions? The kind that don't make headlines in every part of the world, but do touch every part of the societies in which we live. How we learn, how we work, and how we live and think. He'll be in conversation tonight with journalist, author, podcaster, and John Adams director Tracy Metz, who brings her own sharp insight into the built environment and climate resilience questions. And later in the evening, they will together be joined by Nick Kounis, an economist at ABN AMRO, whose expertise will help us consider the broader financial and policy implications of climate adaptation. At a time when geopolitical concerns dominate the global agenda, wars, elections, rising tensions, the climate crisis is being pushed into the background. But as Slow Burn reminds us, as Jisung Park reminds us, the warming world is still shaping all of our futures, whether or not it is on the front page of the news that we read every day. The effects may indeed be subtle, even silent, but they are no less urgent. And that's exactly why we are here tonight, because understanding these slow and often hidden changes is the first step towards responding to them. And because we believe at the John Adams Institute that dialogue between disciplines, between different perspectives and people is in itself a powerful tool for rethinking what climate resilience and the world around us might look like. So now a quick word on the run of show. Tracy Metz will come up and introduce Jisung Park and his work. Then Park will take the stage for a keynote talk, give or take 15 or 20 minutes, after which Tracy will return for a one-on-one conversation with him. And from there, Nick Kounis will join the discussion, and of course, there will be time for all of your questions as well. I will come back to you at the end of the evening and let you know what else we have coming up here at the John Adams Institute. But without further ado, Tracy, take it away.
Thank you, Ian. Welcome, everybody. As you know, my name is Tracy Metz, and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute and your moderator this evening. That doesn't happen very often. Our guest of the evening is Jisung Park, an environmental and labor economist and assistant professor of social policy and practice at the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, and also at the Wharton School of Business, which I think in business circles is a famous event in itself. And important for us this evening, he is an optimistic man. He thinks the climate catastrophe can be averted. He believes that progress has indeed been made in confronting it. And he believes that the costs of climate change push us to identify concrete steps we can and need to take. I hope he's right. In his newest book, Slow Burn, he uses the wonderful phrase, the silent accumulation of 1,000 tiny conflagrations. The slow burn of the title are, as Ian mentioned, the hidden, more subtle, smaller but very important costs already happening now. Wildfires, for example. How many people die in wildfires? Too many. But how many people suffer the effects of the smoke from the wildfires that's blown downwind? Many more. Who knew? How about the loss of productivity from climate disaster? How about lost opportunities for education, opportunities for social mobility? In other words, a climate event is never a one-off. Inequality in production of climate change, because 10% of the earners, that's us here in the wealthy West, emit 50% of the greenhouse gases. There's inequality in the production of climate change, but also in the effects of climate change. One of the observations that Jisung Park makes in this book that really stuck with me was that hardship is not just for poor or developing countries, it's also for poorer people, also in affluent countries, like the Netherlands, the US, France, Germany. And the costs, my friends, are not small. An amazing statistic from this book, 2 degrees of global warming equals about 1 to 3% of GDP. That's about $420 to $630 billion when he was writing the book. That would wipe out the profits of Howie Fost, Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, Alphabet, Microsoft, JP Morgan Chase, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Bank of America, ExxonMobil, and Fannie Mae combined. That is the order of magnitude that we're talking about. And maybe that is what the hidden in the title, the subtitle, the hidden costs of a warming world, maybe that is what that hidden really means. It means it's just too big to wrap our minds around it. We're all looking for clarity in this storm and a reason for hope. And I'm very curious, after hearing Professor Park and Nick Kounis and your questions, I'm very curious how we'll feel at the end of the evening. I hope you'll come by and tell me. Jisung Park, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. Good evening. So first of all, let me start by saying sincerely how grateful I am to be here. Both my wife and I, it's our first time together in the Netherlands, and we were graced with what I'm told is a very rare, beautiful day in the 60s with sun yesterday. So thank you for that, and thank you, Tracy and Ian, for putting together this wonderful event and for inviting us, and for that fantastic introduction, although I will say you set the bar very high for this evening. Let me just start by addressing a fact that Tracy referred to, which is that many of us, I think, when it comes to thinking about or referring to climate change, may have a bit of an emotional reaction to it. At least in my case, at least in the country that I live, which is the United States, it's become a very polarized and polarizing and emotional issue. And for many, certainly those who profess to care about the issue, it's a source of actually a lot of anxiety and in many cases sadness and fear. I think a healthy dose of fear is warranted when dealing with questions of potentially existential magnitude. But I also tend to believe that unless fear or our perceptions of a problem are grounded in data and facts and continually asked constantly to re-examine the factual basis and the data behind our presuppositions of an issue, our emotions can sometimes get the better of us. And I think in terms of climate change, one of the motivations for the book was just to see how much can we ground our societal conversation about the potential effects of this warming in the facts, in the data. So I know I only have maybe 15, 20 minutes, but I just wanted to briefly share with you a few data points. I'll start with the story, and then I'm really looking forward to having a conversation and hearing from you about what's on your mind about this issue. So I can get this to work. So when my wife and I first moved to Los Angeles, this was right after I received my PhD to take on my first job as an assistant professor at UCLA, this was literally the scene on the highway a couple of miles from the apartment we were moving into. There was a wildfire alert. This was the Skirball fire. And I kid you not, this was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. We had a mandatory evacuation order coming 2 blocks from the apartment that we were just moving into. So I remember, my wife looked over at me as we were unpacking our boxes saying, should we be repacking and moving out? This was sort of one of those gut check wake-up calls for, oh wow, climate change feels viscerally scary. For me, it was probably the first time. However, that was at the individual level, and certainly there were many headlines that were made of the wildfires, and many of you, I'm sure, may remember more recent wildfires that made headlines in Los Angeles, right, last fall. What I didn't appreciate at the time was that as damaging and deadly and frankly terrifying as the flames of those wildfires were, it turns out that from a statistical perspective for the economy as a whole, it may be the case that at least in terms of the mortality consequences, the lives lost due to wildfires in the US, the smoke, as Tracy alluded to, may be more deadly. This is not research of my own, but let me just point out this fact before we move on. So since 2005, official records suggest that wildfires in the US have destroyed over 6,000 homes and caused roughly, a dozen or two deaths per year in the United States, okay? And that's, as Tracy mentioned, too many. But recent estimates by researchers at Harvard and Stanford and elsewhere suggest that the smoke, which carries quite far, right? I mean, we now know that smoke from the wildfires in California or Canada can affect places as far as Florida, New York, even parts of Europe. The smoke may have been responsible for 5,000 to 15,000 additional deaths per year in that same period. Many of these deaths will not be officially recognized as being related to wildfire smoke, right? Many of these will not even be individually recognizable as being related to smoke or air pollution. But we have good reason to suspect, and if in the Q&A, if I have time, I'd love to go into the methodological details as to how we have these reasons or why we think this way. But we have good reason to suspect that the cumulative consequence of wildfire smoke may be causally responsible for thousands of deaths per year. And while there is a lot of uncertainty in making climate projections, at least the best available evidence to my knowledge suggests that climate change just in the near future, we're not talking about 2100, just by 2050, may lead to an additional 20,000 plus smoke-related deaths in the US per year. So that's just a statistic I was not aware of until recently. Certainly when it came to my personal experience of climate change, it did not seem first order at the time of the flames when we were moving in. But from a societal perspective, looking at the data, I'm pretty confident in saying that the smoke is much more damaging than many of us may intuitively feel. So that is in some sense, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, that is in some sense one of the key messages or hypotheses really of the book, which is that when it comes to climate change, yes, we are our emotional and psychological hardwiring may incline us to focus on the salient climate disasters, and these are devastating in themselves. And moreover, our psychological wiring and maybe some of the political realities of where we live may compel us to talk about climate change as a black or white existential crisis for humanity or not kind of issue. However, the premise of the book is that maybe in addition to thinking about this potential catastrophe, maybe in addition to thinking about climate change as whether or not it's a potential catastrophe, we should also focus on these subtler damages, which really encourage us to think of it more as a sliding scale, right? A matter of different gradations of quality of life being impacted by climate change, as opposed to or in addition to this framing of whether or not it is a civilizational catastrophe for all of mankind. So that's the first sort of observation that the book tries to make. The second, and putting on more sort of a business-minded hat for a minute, is that if you think about the various asset categories or the elements of human experience that might be affected by climate change, there's an important distinction to be made between physical capital, I'm having a little trouble with the clicker, physical capital, right, which refers to things like residential and commercial real estate, factories, a lot of brick and mortar things that we can see, and we can see being damaged by wildfires, floods, hurricanes, etc. Between that and human capital, which refers to, right, the health of our bodies, our ability to concentrate, our ability to be productive, our ability to imagine, right, a future of economic livelihood. And if I had to distill the book in sort of one sentence, it is that in addition to the sort of long-run catastrophe scenarios that we have been focusing on in much of our conversation about climate change, we might also want to focus on what I'm calling the more subtle, hidden, slower-burning aspect of it, which not only affects the physical capital of our economies, but also inherently affects the human capital of our economies. So I've been told that I have a little bit less time than I thought, so I'm going to skip ahead a bit. I hope you don't mind. Please close your eyes if you have a little bit of... But I just want to give you one example of what this means. So you may all be familiar with the fact that at this point, the world on average has warmed by roughly 1.2, maybe 1.3 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial times, and that even if we were to stop emitting carbon entirely today, that warming, and perhaps a little bit more than that, will persist for many decades into the future. Frankly, in a place like the Netherlands, that doesn't lead to an enormous amount of extreme heat. There will probably be maybe a handful to a dozen more days that are uncomfortably hot, maybe in the high 20s or low 30s Celsius. But in many parts of the world, even in a place like the US, Atlanta for instance, we're talking about 50 additional days per year above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius within the next 20 to 30 years. In a place like Mumbai in India or Accra, Ghana, that number is well over 100. So imagine, on top of how much heat you get in those places every year today, 100 additional days per year where it is perhaps dangerously hot, right, for human survival. One of the research studies that I highlight in the book, which my team and co-authors and I, including Patrick Baer at the World Bank and Nora Pankratz at the University of Toronto, have explored, is this question of, well, what does that added heat mean for workers? Right? And I think it's important to remember the fact that globally, even today, there are over 1 billion individuals for whom agriculture is their primary occupation, and several 100 million additional workers on top of that who work in manufacturing, transportation, and other industries that are typically exposed to the elements on a day-to-day basis. In the US, right, there are roughly 100 million workers who don't have a college degree. 68% of those report routine exposure to harsh environmental conditions on the job. So we wanted to understand, for instance, well, what does hotter temperature mean for workplace safety and worker health? And we really wanted to ask the data to tell us the answer to this question. And so one of the things that we did in this study is we teamed up with the California state government, who graciously provided us access to some of their data on workers' compensation insurance claims. So if you can imagine, 14 million insurance claims from the state of California, which importantly, and this is the sort of one bit of methodological detail that I'll go into, at least for this portion of the evening. Importantly, each of these records have the date of the injury and the location of the workplace injury, which allows us to link that to daily weather data historically, and it allows us to do something that, if we were to try to do this experimentally, would be wholly unethical and impractical, right? If you can imagine trying to run a randomized controlled trial or experiment where you randomly expose workers to heat and wait until some of them get injured, who in their right minds would ever propose a study like that? However, for better or for worse, we're able to line up the data in such a way, given sort of the largeness and the temporal and spatial detail of the data, we're able to line it up in such a way that makes it as if nature herself has run a series of these kinds of natural experiments. The upshot of that is that allows us to make claims and inferences about what a slightly hotter world might look like with a little bit more statistical rigor than before. So just to give you the punchline, we find that in our data, even in the United States, which by the way is one of the most highly air-conditioned and rich countries on the planet, and apologies for the Fahrenheit usage here, an 85-degree Fahrenheit day, which I think roughly translates to something like 29, 30 degrees Celsius, please someone correct me if I'm wrong, results in anywhere between a 5 and a 45% increase in the likelihood of a worker being severely injured on the job. That varies a lot by industry. So we find that the biggest effects are in industries such as agriculture, something weird happened with the slides. Agriculture, mining and utilities and construction. But interestingly, we also find that the effects of heat extend beyond outdoor environments, including to many indoor industries that you wouldn't typically associate with being exposed to climate change. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about workers in warehousing. I'm talking about workers in some manufacturing operations. Even in some retail and food service industries, it appears to be the case that for whatever reason, on a hotter day, you are more likely to be hurt on the job. And we estimate actually that all told in California, hotter temperature, even without the significant climate change of the future, just in the last 20 years, on average may have caused anywhere between 5,000 and 15,000 additional workplace injuries that would not have taken place if everyone were protected from the heat. This is consistent with some sort of more qualitative reports of workers in these settings. And I'm not going to read all these quotes here, but I'll just mention the fact that, again, in many industries that we typically associate with being indoors, if it is hot enough outdoors, it appears to be the case that for whatever reason, maybe it's because cooling is expensive, maybe it's because workers and managers are not fully aware of the additional effect of heat on workplace safety and or productivity. But it appears to be the case that there is a statistically significant and economically meaningful signal when it comes to how heat affects workplace safety. And I just want to emphasize one last statistical point before I conclude my formal remarks from now. One of the reasons why I'm referring to these as hidden costs is that not all of these, in fact, most of these, do not appear to be recorded in official statistics as being related to hotter temperature. So if you ask, I'm not a physician, but if you ask a physician, they will tell you that if you take someone, let's just talk about fatalities for a moment. If you take a fatality and the coroner is trying to determine what was the cause of this death, it is apparently very difficult to ascertain whether a particular death or even an injury was due to heat exhaustion or heat illness. However, again, given the methods and the sort of the largeness and the breadth of the data that we were able to bring to these research questions, we're able to discern with, again, higher confidence that the vast majority actually of the additional injuries and illnesses that are associated with hotter temperature are not officially recognized as such. So this is a sense in which, at least in the book, I try to make the claim that there may be many hidden dimensions of climate change-related costs that we may want to pay attention to. So I know I'm relatively short on time. I'm going to skip ahead just to mention that in the book I go through other research by many other environmental economists, much of which has surfaced just in the last 5 to 10 years, which illustrate, in a lot of detail how hotter temperatures lead to more local crime. They lead to more emergency department visits, even reductions of professional sports performance. Tennis players apparently have more double faults and run shorter distances in matches when the temperature is hot when they play. We also have evidence suggesting that on a hotter day, our mood is affected, and maybe this is not that difficult to intuit, but you see this actually in Twitter data, right, in terms of the frequency of the usage of profanity, for instance. And on and on and on. So it appears to be the case that even in developed economies, even moderately what you might call non-catastrophic amounts of warming appear to sort of muck up the gears of our economy and lead to effects that may influence our quality of life adversely in ways that are measurable, in ways that add up. So I'm just going to conclude by focusing on two sort of, so what aspects of this work. And I would love to go into more detail of the studies themselves and also other aspects of climate change, because I've only touched on one very small piece of it, which is hotter temperature. There's obviously flooding and wildfires and other dimensions. But I just want to highlight two pieces. One piece is that the economic evidence suggests, at this point I think somewhat overwhelmingly, that the social costs of inaction when it comes to climate change, so if you were to add up all of the measurable damages that we think climate change may lead to, add them all up, both from now into the future, discount them back, and express them as one number, which is the social cost of carbon, the current EPA estimates, well, not so current anymore, as of last year anyway, the EPA estimates, which take sort of the scientific literature at the moment, suggest that the social damages from emitting an additional ton of CO2 into the atmosphere are roughly $190 per ton. As an economist, I look at that and I say, well, okay, from society's standpoint, if I were a social planner making policy for the world as a whole, we should be willing to invest in any green technology or mitigation strategy that costs less than $190 per ton. And mind you, we're only able to quantify the things that we can measure. If you believe that there are other effects that we have not yet measured well, then maybe this is an underestimate. Indeed, there's a more recent paper that just came out last year that I didn't even get to talk about in the book, which takes a different top-down approach and actually estimates that a 1 degree Celsius hotter than average year, all told, leads to damages for the world economy of approximately 12% of GDP. So that suggests that even that $190 per ton number is probably a gross underestimate of the social cost. So all of that just to me suggests that if you believe in statistics and data, and if you believe in the basic premise of cost-benefit analysis for policymaking, and then there are many issues there, both philosophically and technically when it comes to climate change. But if you believe in that premise, that the economics would suggest that it makes sense to make aggressive action on mitigation just from the standpoint of the dollars and cents alone, again, if you think about social costs. Another so what implication of this research is that just from a pragmatic standpoint, and I know there are many ideological features of this debate, but simply thinking pragmatically, given the amount of warming that is at this point locked in, and given what the data suggests about how damaging even non-catastrophic amounts of warming may be for a given city, country, institution, company, etc., that it may make a lot of sense to think proactively and carefully and in an evidence-based way about how we may adapt, how we may improve our resilience, our ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from the increasing climate risks and climate shocks that we are bound to see in the future. So I'll just leave it there. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak. You sit down.
First, a personal question, Jisung. Were you shocked by the outcome of your own research?
You mean the worker safety research that I just showed you?
For example?
Yeah.
And 12% of world GDP, I mean, that is such a massive amount of money.
So let me address the latter. I was actually shocked by that last number. That is not a study that I conducted, but at least as far as I can tell, the methods are quite sophisticated, and I believe the number, but I'm shocked by how big it is. Were we shocked by our own study? Yes and no. We had read from other qualitative reports, both in industry reports and among workers and regulators, that it seems possible that we may be sort of underestimating, Public health professionals have been kind of noting anecdotally that our official estimates of heat's impacts on health may be underestimates. So we had some clues. But yeah, I mean, some of those effects are much larger than intuitively would make sense to us. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, so I don't want to undermine your attitude towards this research, but it made me wonder, because you say that understanding the tangible, more subtle, smaller, close-to-home effects of climate change, the wildfires, the heat, that will make it easier for us to understand, to get a grip on it, and therefore will empower us to act. But reading your book, to be honest, it just made me more scared. It's so close to home. It's so real. Making it tangible makes it tangible. And that made me even more scared than I were when I was thinking, this huge climate catastrophe somewhere far down the road. It worries me, but it doesn't worry me as much as all the stuff that I read in your book.
I see. That's interesting. No, first of all, I appreciate the question and your candor, and I realize that in your opening remarks, you suggested that I am an optimist, which I am, and that, or at least you posed the hypothesis of whether at the end of the evening we may all feel better about the issue of climate change, and I realized I shared a lot of maybe data that might make you feel the other way around.
So why are you optimistic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Some of it depends on what your starting point is. Mm-hmm. But I'll answer it this way. I have met many people, young and old, but particularly young people, who really have been fed a message that climate change is emphatically an existential threat, and that we are close to, if not having already crossed the threshold of no return. I've had many people ask me, should I even have children? Because our climate is so, doomed. We're so doomed. And I think, so to the extent that, I think the counterpoint that I'm trying to make is that if we only talk about climate change in terms of the hypothetical 200-year, 100-year global future scenario, it's easy for our emotional state to fill in a lot of the gaps in a way that maybe inspires more fear, more doomsday thinking. And that emotion, that mindset is perhaps not the most conducive to action. My hypothesis, and we'll wait to see whether it is borne out by readers, but
How old are you?
I'm 38.
You can wait.
But my hypothesis is that by making more concrete the everyday costs of climate change, not as a substitute for thinking about climate change, acting on climate change as a form of sort of global catastrophe insurance, but as a complement to it, may make us think about it, again, less as a hypothetical over which we have no control, and more as a lived reality that we are going to have to live with. And if you change your mindset toward, okay, this is something I will have to deal with, I will have to take proactive steps to protect my children's future, if you're the head of an organization, my organization's assets from these risks. If you start orienting toward the practical steps, my thought was that it would incline you to think of climate change less as a fictional issue and more as a reality that you have to contend with. And that part of your brain, I believe, is much more inclined to positive problem solving than the sort of fictional, like, is this a end of the world or not kind of scenario.
But Jisung, isn't it just human nature to ignore the disaster in the making far down the road or further down the road in favor of the disaster on your doorstep?
Yes, that is true. So I guess to the extent that you're saying that it's inherent to human nature to ignore the longer term problems, is what you're saying. Yeah. And that is...
We know what we need to do, but we don't do it.
That's true. We've done some.
Yeah.
We've done some. I think it's worth mentioning that, thanks in large part, and I'm not just saying this because to be political, but in large part because of leadership of the EU globally, the cost of solar has fallen very dramatically in the last 15 years, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that would not have happened without prescient policymaking on part of EU governments. The cost of wind has plummeted by over 70% in the last 2 decades. So we've made a lot of progress, and even in terms of emissions reductions, we're certainly nowhere near what many scientists have been saying for a long time, and our stated ambitions in the Paris Agreement, for example. But it is the case that we have made some progress. So it's and not only because of that, the projections of the amount of warming that we will experience over the next 50 to 100 years has actually, come down considerably. We used to, 10, 15 years ago, we were on pace. We thought we were on pace for warming of around 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Of course, there are large uncertainty bands around that. But now we're talking about something maybe on the order of 2 to 3 degrees. That's still a lot of warming, and as I mentioned, that could be very costly. But I think it's worth noting that, it's not as if we haven't done anything. And whether or not it is enough, again, I think benefits from thinking about climate change less as black and white, more as a sliding scale. Each increment that we do actually gets us in the right direction. It's not that because we are already at 1.5 degrees Celsius, when you're dieting, you start a diet, it doesn't look like you need to diet, but if you're dieting, right, there's a point where you're on a strict diet, and then you went to a friend's birthday party, and then you went to a wedding, and you had a few pieces of cake, and then you had a little bit more cake, and you're like, you know what, screw it. I'm already screwed, forget the diet. I worry that the messaging around climate change risks that attitude, right? Where it's, if you've passed a particular threshold, it's not worth bothering anymore. But the reality, at least based on the evidence that I'm familiar with, is that it's much more of a spectrum of different shades of gray, and that every increment of mitigation that we are successful at achieving does have quantifiable benefits, right, that occur now and into the future. So I don't know if that answers your question, but at least that's how I think about it.
Well, beautifully said. I wanted to come back to what you said in your introduction about the frame of the climate catastrophe, which is so far beyond our control that we'll just a priori give up.
Right.
And you mentioned the media several times, and since I am from the media, I am very sensitive to the suggestion that everything is the fault of the media. To what extent is it the fault of the media that climate change is portrayed as something beyond our scope that makes us powerless?
Tracy, that's a fair question.
Be open. Be honest.
I think the honest answer is that I don't know how useful it is to find fault. I do think it is consistent with just human nature to be drawn to the more sensationalist headlines. That is human nature. That's not the media's fault. It is not the media's fault, I think, that the economic model for survival in the landscape of journalism is predicated on clicks in a 24-hour news cycle. Like, that's not the media's fault per se. That's a structural issue, in my opinion. It's always easy for an academic from his ivory tower to say, if only people were to think differently. And I hope I'm not falling into that trap. But I do believe that the role of educated civil society is to push against those aspects of human nature that keep us from being able to see the truth clearly in an actionable way. And I believe it is also the role of the media to push back against that tendency when possible as well. And to the extent that even the long-form coverage of climate change, which is not the 24-hour news cycle, has, at least in many Western countries, I think, been dominated for a long time with the sort of 200-year, 100-year doomsday kind of scenarios. I do think there is room for alternative ways of characterizing climate change that may perhaps both broaden the tent of interested parties and also slightly change the emotional and ideological sort of dimensions along which the issue is often discussed, if that makes sense.
And how has the media reaction been to your work about the more subtle, more hidden increments that really bring it closer to home what climate change is doing on a daily basis? Well, you're here. You're on
I'm
book
here.
tour.
Again, I think of myself as a humble academic just trying to bridge the gap between the reality that I live in terms of the research and the data that I live and breathe in and everyday decision makers. At least in my experience and based on the reception in the United States, it appears to be true that people appreciate learning about these dimensions of climate change. We didn't talk about this yet, but there's some other work that we've done looking at, for instance, how heat affects students and their learning. In the US, it's not a huge effect, but it's a highly unequal effect, and it's a significant enough of an effect to where, if you are a parent that didn't care about climate change, but the minute you hear that your student might be affected, you start to pay attention. Is that a win? I don't know, but at least it has generated a conversation.
Speaking of the students and the impact of heat on students' achievements, there's also a racial component here that you mentioned but really didn't go into that much, and I was triggered by that because you say that school kids in classrooms without air conditioning, you have the wonderful term for that, their thermal geography. If their thermal geography is such that they're too hot all the time, there's at least a 7% gap in educational achievements between children in poorly equipped schools and children where there is airco. Is that racial component something you can address?
Sure. So some of it may be particularly germane to the US context, where socioeconomic inequality and racial inequality and the history of slavery are so intertwined. Obviously, that's true in other countries as well. But in the case of US schooling, there are, at the moment, very large and very persistent achievement gaps between white students and underrepresented minorities, particularly Black and Hispanic students. One of I think the findings that you're referring to from a paper with Josh Goodman, Mike Hurwitz, and Jonathan Smith is where we actually took data from College Board. This is the entity that administers the US SAT exam and the PSAT exam, and we were able to show that hotter than average years lead to lower than average rates of learning, much more so for Black and Hispanic students. We don't know exactly why that is the case, but we have some suggestive evidence that this may be in part due to the fact that Black and Hispanic students tend to go to schools in buildings that either don't have air conditioning or have less working air conditioning. And so that 7% figure is referring to the estimated achievement gap that can be attributed to both living in hotter places and living in hotter places without air conditioning. I don't know whether that same kind of racial dynamic is at play in other countries, but if it is the case that underrepresented minorities in other countries also tend to be disadvantaged from a resource standpoint, and if you have sort of sorting in terms of residential environments, right, segregation, the way that the US does, I wouldn't be surprised if similar patterns hold true. And I think the broader message from that, again, and you alluded to this in your opening introduction, is that in addition to thinking about climate change as sort of a global north, global south inequality problem, it also probably makes sense to at least appreciate the way in which climate change may potentially exacerbate inequalities across individuals within countries, even within richer countries. And if you care at all about the political economy, right, of support for or interest in climate policy, you may want to understand those dynamics as well. Yeah.
Before I invite Nick Kounis up to the stage, I wanted to ask the audience if there are any questions for Jisung so far. Yes, we have one. Microphone is on its way. Could you stand up, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for sharing your insights. There is a school of thinking that argues that we should forget about climate adaptation because it takes away our focus from fighting further climate change. I believe you've shown that climate change has all kinds of hidden costs that we never measured before. That makes further climate change even worse than we already thought. And we thought it was pretty bad already.
Right.
But you also showed that even without further climate change, there's a tremendous hidden cost already for all the climate change that we've already experienced. And that kind of calls for, yes, climate adaptation. Suppose you had $1 to spend, and looking at the social cost of all the climate change you've had so far and the social cost of further climate change, where would you spend your dollar? On climate adaptation or on fighting further climate change?
Wow. First of all, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. It's a very fair question, especially to an economist, right? Constrained optimization is what we're all about. But I must say, that's a difficult question. To be honest, I sometimes have trouble sleeping because I worry that a takeaway from the book might be that we should focus on adaptation at the expense of mitigation. I think that would be a mistake. In an ideal world, you would not have to make such tough decisions. In an ideal world, the budgets from which you draw climate adaptation funds are very different from the budgets from which you draw climate mitigation funds, because they are in some senses addressing different aspects of the problem. And I can talk about what I mean by that if we have time. But if you were really to, push me to, make a decision, it would really depend on what country we are in. Because $1 spent on mitigation in a country that has already decarbonized a lot of its electricity grid, maybe not a good use. But if $1 spent on a country where you haven't even begun to, move away from fossil fuels, that's probably the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit is probably quite low, and so I would suggest mitigation there. It's tricky even to speculate about this because we have so little evidence about what works in terms of adaptation, what the cost benefit is, right? We know so much more now about who is affected by climate change and what those costs are. But we have admittedly very little evidentiary basis about what adaptations work at what cost-benefit ratio, which should you choose. So it's sort of like comparing something where we have relatively known costs and something where we have very unknown costs. And so I'm gravitating in a risk-averse way toward the thing that we know. But just in a more general sense, I think because, maybe to your earlier point, Tracy, it is human nature to focus on the problems that are more short-term in nature. I anticipate that even without any kind of civil society pressure to do so, adaptation investments will happen. Because for the most part, it will be in private interests to adapt. Now, of course, there are many ways that could happen that are more efficient, more equitable, more social cohesion creating than not. But mitigation, I think, will not happen unless we continue to underscore the costs of not acting on climate change, the damages from climate change. So I guess I've convinced myself through my answer that at least you want to begin with
took a while.
mitigation. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, we have a question in the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Madeline Swanson. I'm a Minnesotan environmentalist studying here at the VU, and I had a question about your role of educated civil society and how we can work to further that and better that, as well as nurturing roles for fostering future leaders in climate change and climate adaptation and mitigation. Thank you so much.
So the question is how we can equip.
Yeah, how can we foster an educated civil society and further equip leaders for to mitigate future climate change?
Yeah, great question. Do you have it?
By writing books. Sorry, that was an incorporative.
By reading books.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a witty answer off the top of my head, but I will start by saying that I think the more individuals in society can think of climate change as not just an environmental issue, but as an issue that touches on many aspects of society, whether it's healthcare, labor productivity, worker rights, infrastructure, and we already see this trend, but the more we can sort of expand our imaginary set as to what climate change touches in society, I think you have a better chance of drawing bright and inspired minds to work on different aspects of the problem in creative ways. And this is speaking as someone who is, really at heart and began his career as an environmentalist. I'm very much a child of the great outdoors, and most of my motivation for beginning this work was in my love for the natural world. But I know that not everyone shares that same passion, and that's totally fine. And I think the more avenues of understanding how climate change touches on different aspects of society, that might be one way to start.
We have with us actually a colleague of yours from UPenn, who is an educator, Simon Richter, who's also an expert on Dutch water. Simon, stand up and tell us, Mika, he's right here. How would you answer this question as an educator yourself? And I know you have a fantastic array of educational tools. You make funny cartoon videos. You go out on field trips with students. You are the most active educator I've ever met. So how about you answer her question?
I think I agree with Jisung a lot about the importance of raising awareness, about sharing, educating students. My feeling is the more people know, I think the less afraid they'll be and the more inclined they'll be to act. So I think many people have a vague sense of what climate change is, what the impacts are. They imagine them in various ways, but they're all tend to be immobilizing ways or ways that stand in the way of action. So I really want to take my students to the facts, but also to take them to experts, and especially to young experts who are busy in the field. And that can be across the whole range of disciplines, of areas, regions, et cetera, that Jisung was talking about. When they see young people slightly older than themselves who are working, in a dedicated way, in a collaborative way, and so on, that can really be inspiring. So anything that will get them to realize that there are folks who are working on this, there are many people who are working on it. They are, as Jisung said, making lots of progress, not enough, but they're making lots of progress. I think that's what helps us get down the road.
Thank you, Simon. I know you weren't expecting this, so thanks very much. Nick, why don't you come up and join us? This is Nick Kounis, people. Can I have an applause for him? I did want to mention, many of you who get our newsletter and look at our website know that originally Jisung's co-speaker was to be Wouter van Noort from NRC Handelsblad. Wouter had a tragic death in the family, and the funeral was today. So he had to excuse himself, and Nick Kounis was very kindly willing to jump in at the last minute and join us with just a minimum time for preparation. So thank you very much, Nick. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
You are a member of the climate team at ABN AMRO. What do you do during the day?
A lot of people ask me that, actually, especially at work. No,
I thought maybe your wife.
I think it was around 5 years ago, we set up a climate economics team at ABN AMRO. The first driver was for regulatory reasons, so we're supervised by the ECB and as well as the DNB and
European Central Bank?
Yes, the European Central Bank, and we're asked to assess, the risks and also opportunities, which come from the transition, the energy transition, but also physical risks from actual climate change. So one of the things we do is build all kinds of scenarios with macroeconomic numbers, like Jisung mentioned, the minus 12%, and then you take that minus 12% and say, okay, what would that mean for our loan book, for instance? How would that affect our credit risk? Are we well capitalized enough to cope with that? How should we change our business strategy? Given these changes, so that's about the climate and energy transition impact on our bank. But we also think about how our bank can contribute on the other side. So, for instance, thinking about is our loan book or is the money that we manage for our clients, our portfolios, is that following a trajectory which is consistent with 1.5 degrees, which is something we're committed to. We're a signed up member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and made commitments as well to our stakeholders and society for that. Yeah, so that's a big part of it. But we also, write a lot of research, for our clients, and conduct also climate scenarios for our clients. So yeah, that's it in a wrap. So yeah.
And I asked you when I invited you to join us this evening, what would you like to ask Jisung? And you gave me some ammunition, but maybe there's first question that you want to fire at him?
Yes, well, I'm very tempted actually, because in preparation for this, I was watching a video, an event like this, which on YouTube, which Jisung was part of, and he got a lot of questions which he answered, as you can imagine, very well and very eloquently. But there was one question which stumped him, which is, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a lady in the audience who said, how will climate change affect my skin? And I think you were a bit speechless, saying, well, I don't know, I've not really seen any data which, but I'm not going to ask you that.
Okay, good. I thought you were going to say, no, I'm just going to get up here and embarrass him all over again.
No. But I was a bit tempted, because I found it so funny, actually. And I thought she was going to follow up with, what kind of skincare regime should I, no, but what I would like to ask you, because, you said, I'm an optimist, and, I guess it depends, glass half full, glass half empty, and, but, I can see your point of view. But, of course, we've seen quite some policy changes over the last, say, 6 months or so, with the election of President Trump. The US has left the Paris Agreement. Right. The US has left the network for greening the NGFS, greening the financial system. We've seen a lot of banks, US and Canadian banks, leaving the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Even here, we've started to see some shifts, maybe a little bit in reaction to that. Are you still optimistic, and how do you think these changes change your worldview?
That is a great question. I wonder if that lady's question was motivated by the fact that South Korea has so many good skincare products. I should just assume that my wife, because my wife has flawless skin, that I would know something about that. No, look, let's be real. I mean, you can profess to be an optimist, but there are some days where we don't feel. It's very hard to feel that way, and sometimes you don't want to just engage in Pollyannish wishful thinking. And it is very true that in the last several months, certainly in the US, for instance, federal policy has really done a complete 180 on many aspects of climate policy. I'm hopeful that at least some dimensions of climate policy are more durable than this current administration, but it remains to be seen. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I really do need to acknowledge that. And
do you fear for the funding of your own research?
That's a great question. I certainly have colleagues who've had their research projects that were funded by federal grants, had their funding completely taken away. I know
now already.
Yep, yeah, and I know colleagues who have had access to data. Worries that access to federal data sets might be compromised. So it's very much.
I've understood that a lot of federal data sets have indeed just disappeared.
Yep.
From the web, data from the Environmental Protection Agency, from the NOAA, climate data that has just vanished.
Yes, and not only could that be damaging for researchers, it's also potentially damaging for everyday citizens. I just saw an article in the New York Times that was saying that a group of farmers are suing the federal government for getting rid of data that they were actively using to engage in climate adaptation, to make plans for how they should
to feed the American people.
To feed the American people and the rest of the world in some ways, given at least the current interconnectivity of global trade. So to answer your question, it's hard to be optimistic about the broader policy environment, but I think it's still early days, and it remains to be seen how much of the actions that are currently taking place will truly reverse the gains that have occurred. Look, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States during the Biden administration was and still remains the largest sort of piece of climate policy in the US, perhaps ever. That alone didn't get us, nearly close to all the way to meeting Paris Agreement goals, but it got us, it's supposed to get us quite a bit of the way there. I don't know enough about the details of the legal kind of, again, pieces of the puzzle, whether the actions of the current administration will hold up in court. But it's really disturbing. It's distressing, at least from the standpoint of someone who reads the data as, supporting more aggressive mitigation. But again, I guess I'm still...
You're an optimistic man.
I try, and again, the data suggests, look, it's hard to reverse the price trends in the market that have already happened. It's like you could, but it's hard to imagine that the dramatic reduction in the cost of solar and wind, yes, you can take away some of the price supports that the policies provided, but to the extent that a lot of the momentum that has been generated is a function of innovation that has occurred in the past, it's hard to erase innovation, thankfully. And so that piece of it at least gives me a little bit of hope that, maybe we're kind of in a pause mode, but there are tailwinds from previous technological innovation when it comes to mitigation. But look, at the end of the day, I do believe that unless you have some de facto price on carbon, right, and I say de facto because you could have it as a real carbon tax or other policies that make it as if you have a carbon tax, it's difficult to imagine that we continue moving toward, a decarbonized economy. So yeah, it is very concerning. Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of this, Jisung, but the pressure from the US is also already reaching the Netherlands. Scientists at the University of Wageningen here have received questionnaires from the US Geological Survey, which they work together with, on the mapping of deforestation by satellites. So not the most front-facing topic. And in that questionnaire, there were questions like, can you confirm that this is not a climate or environmental justice project? This is a climate project. And does this project have quantifiable advantages for the American economy? I find this shocking, that the long arm of the anti-climate movement or the climate deniers movement goes so far as to impact collaborations with other countries. Did you know this?
I did not know this.
No.
And yeah, I do find it disturbing. It's just sad because, look, I mean, we all are, I believe that we are all, we all have a right to political preferences and ideological preferences, but to some extent, I guess I'm saddened by the extent to which climate change has become this ideological issue, because to me, it's very much just a matter of what the facts on the ground suggest. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about the facts, and how you interpret that uncertainty is certainly a function of your, if you're not careful, your ideology and your political preferences. But as a scientist, as an economist, I just think of it as, okay, like, what are the costs of inaction? What are the costs of action? And to me, it just seems like an issue that could be less politicized, but that's yeah.
What I really don't understand about this, and I hope that you can help me understand, is that this extraordinary statistic that I quoted in the beginning from your book about the 2 degrees temperature rise and the incredible impact on the economy, wiping out an amount tantamount to the profits of all these enormous companies. That seems to me to be a very convincing argument, a financial argument, to move ahead and try to stop climate change if it's costing us this much money. If money is the only thing you're interested in, this is already a very good reason to move ahead against this.
Yeah, I would hope so. And maybe you can chime in if you have other views. But it is worth pointing out, I guess, that if you are to take a very kind of incredibly isolationist, self-centered perspective of the world, the costs that we were talking about, and by the way, those are probably the numbers that you quoted from my book are at this point even already probably underestimates based on new evidence. It is worth being very clear that because climate change policy, climate mitigation, that is the energy transition, is responding to a global public good problem. I'm sure I'm reminding everyone of things they already know. There is a free rider problem inherent to this. In other words, the costs that we quoted are the global aggregate costs of 1 ton of CO2 that I emit. The costs of not emitting that CO2 are borne by me being the United States, the Netherlands, whoever you want that actor to be. And so without coordination and policy, it can be difficult to justify that action unless you are taking society's perspective on it. And that really is why I think most economists, maybe all economists, would agree with the statement that, at least I would think, that there is some important role for policy to play in right, mitigating climate change. What form that takes, there's a lot of, I think, healthy debate. I don't know if that answers your question. I think that's something we should remember about the cost numbers that we quoted. Those are global costs. What's interesting is that if you, the recent paper that I cited, the Bilal et al. Paper, suggests that if you only count the damages from climate change to the United States, they're so significant now, at least according to that estimate, that those costs alone would justify aggressive action on mitigation. So that kind of gives you a sense of maybe we're, right, even from a sort of selfish individual country perspective, the economics now add up to a point where aggressive mitigation.
Well, it's a big country and a big economy.
It is a big country and a big economy, yeah.
Nick, what we're talking about here really is awareness and awareness of the consequences. When you have these conversations with your clients about their loan books or their credit risks, what kind of awareness do you encounter? Are these your clients all over the world?
Yes. Well, mainly in Europe, but also in other countries or other regions. I think awareness is there, but I think for the private sector, the sense is that policymakers or governments are the protagonist, and it's difficult for you, either as a bank or a company, to go faster. So if you're committed to 1.5 degrees, and your government or governments around the world are shifting policy in a way which is, say, consistent with, current policies are 2.5, 2.7. So you have a difference in speed issue, right? So you're saying, well, I will really struggle to stay on a 1.5 degree pathway when the rest of the economy is not. So to give you an example for a bank, for instance, that means that we would have to, we have to essentially increase our green asset proportion and reduce our brown asset proportion, consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. But if green assets in the whole economy are growing very slowly, we then either have to get a bigger and bigger share of those green assets, so we have to, which is quite difficult, but, in a competitive marketplace, or we need to shrink, because basically we just need to get rid of all our brown assets and, become a much smaller green bank, which I'm not sure helps anyone. And I think that companies are, different companies in different sectors face the same issue. And I think that might be one reason why many US and Canadian banks left the Net Zero Banking Alliance, because they were saying, well, look, we can't be going in this direction if US climate policy is going in a completely different direction. So, I think that's, an clear area of tension. But certainly people are committed, they are aware, they want to go for these kind of trajectories, but they feel that policy is not supportive enough, essentially.
On the contrary, right now.
Yes, I was being polite.
Oh, yeah, you're English, I forgot.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to talk briefly about insurance, because I am convinced that insurance is the next big climate frontier, or our reaction to climate change. Because the insurers, I think they are perhaps in this whole field the least troubled by ideology. They just look at what is actually happening. They see credit risks. They see enormous expense being caused by climate change. And for that reason, we see that fewer and fewer people are insured. Mm-hmm. So that's, I mean, it's very cynical, but I guess that is the nature of insurance, is perhaps actually a very cynical business. They can't, you know the saying, they give you an umbrella on a sunny day. But insurance companies cannot ignore the increasing number and value of climate-related disasters. So is this going to be a game changer for the financial industry?
That's a big question. Let me attempt to chip away at it. My guess, and I'm sure we have many in the room who may be even better positioned to answer at least part of this question, but my attempt would be to say yes. I mean, look, I've always imagined and certainly read reports that are consistent with this idea that the insurance industry has maybe been the most clairvoyant about climate risks, you know, for a long time, because they typically have their books, the time horizons of interest for them and the kind of the asset kind of breadth of asset exposure is so wide that they do have to think about it in these scales. And you look, I'm not an expert on insurance, but at least what I see in the US suggests that the dominoes are kind of beginning to fall, right? Where you see increasingly homes in places like Florida and California are uninsurable in the private market. That's probably because, right, the risk is now just too high, whether it's flooding or wildfire. And that begs really important questions about, okay, how will the market and how will policymakers respond? Those are adaptation-related questions. Yeah, so
I'm also curious about how this will affect our resilience after a climate disaster. If you're not insured, you won't get any money to rebuild your house.
Oh,
you can't sell your house without insurance.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
It's a devastating prospect. I mean, if you think about, again, in the US context, for the majority of Americans, their home is their largest store of wealth.
I think for all of us, no?
That's probably true, yeah. I would imagine that that's the case. And if, to the extent that you are exposed to climate risk and not able to insure against that, potentially locally catastrophic climate risk, it is, it's a really troubling situation. And look, there are many important conversations, again, to the earlier question about, you know, is it adaptation or mitigation? The conversations have to happen in parallel just by necessity, right? There are policy conversations in the wake of the LA fires, right? About, okay, like to what extent should the state provide a backstop? And what kinds of incentives does that provide for homeowners, right? Does that lead to homeowners rebuilding in places where they shouldn't be rebuilding? Like, these are really important policy questions that need to be settled.
Until just very recently, the Federal Emergency, the FEMA Management Authority, would only give you money to rebuild after a flood or a fire, didn't matter, after a disaster, if you rebuilt on the same place. When I think, didn't we just have proved to us that this was maybe not a smart place to build, to live?
Case in point of,
But now I think we're doing away with FEMA altogether. So that problem has solved itself. Speaking of cynical. Jisung, I wanted to ask you, the whole conversation about climate change and the framing, has that traditionally been focused too much on the ecological side of climate change and too little on what your research addresses is the social impact?
It's a great question. It's also a difficult one in the sense that, you know, too much is, I think, in the eye of the beholder. I personally tend to care a lot about the ecological side, even though my research has focused almost exclusively on the human side. Part of the decision to focus my research on the human side was motivated in part by this notion that, you know, I came from kind of a community where the ecological piece was front of mind, but a recognition that the world is bigger than that, and there are many other potential costs of climate change. So it makes sense to understand them. And again, here to the extent that if you believe the premise that part of the, let's call it politicization and I don't know what the verb form of making more ideological of climate change was in part, if it was true that it is in part because of this kind of emphasis on sort of the ecological piece of it, then maybe a little bit of balancing could be helpful. But I'm not sure about that anymore, just given the way that politics works.
Yeah. Nick, when you have your difficult conversations about the loan book and credit risk, do you see your clients, what do they have more eye for the ecological side of the climate or the social aspect?
Well, I think, well, first and foremost, they're, it's a financial issue. So they're, thinking about profits, financial risks, what their investors want, because, ESG is a big trend among institutional investors. So, they want to, meet commitments that they are asking for. So, a lot of it is, financial. And actually, I think that's not such a bad thing, because I think it's important for people to understand. And I think Jisung was making the point about, economic costs and benefits. And, even if you have not an ethical bone in your whole body, just the economics and the finance of it,
the cost of inactivity.
Sense. Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't have to be an ethical argument. I think it is an ethical argument, of course, but it doesn't have to be. So I actually personally always try to stay away completely from ethics. They always say don't talk to your clients about politics or religion or ethics. So, but I think you can very strongly and easily make economic and financial arguments, essentially.
That's a better answer, a similar one that I would have given. Yeah.
Well, I had time to think while you were talking.
I'll take an assist. Yeah, you get the point.
And Nick, do you advise your clients on what you think they should do?
That's a bit of a...
or do you just make a scenario and then leave it to them?
So I'm not a commercial person, so I'm part of a independent research group within ABN AMRO. So, essentially we're not trying to sell anything, or, what we're trying to do is just, present analysis and facts and, let's say help our clients make better decisions. But those are their decisions and they're not linked to, trying to sell particular products. I mean, we have commercial people to do that, but our independence as analysts is really important in that sense. Yeah.
Turning it over to you now. Yes, I see a hand here, and here, and here, and here.
Thank you both for the talk. I'm a student and I work at a financial institution, and also I intern when it comes to climate, so I try to combine those things. And the thing about insurance really struck me, because a few months ago I watched a documentary about the catastrophe bond industry and how the capital markets and private markets now are trying to repackage risks that insurers cannot take anymore. I don't know how familiar both of you are with that industry, but I was really curious about your thoughts about how, because ESG and more returns for pensioners and others is still top of mind for big pension funds and investors, how that might grow in the future, or how that might influence the mitigation or adaptation because of investor preference and the returns that hedge funds, for example, make on catastrophe bonds in the global south and maybe also the global north.
Is that a question for you, Nick?
Well, I'm not a specialist on those securities, but I can say something about it. I mean, these catastrophe bonds, or cat bonds as they're called, it's been growing, but it's actually, if you look at the size of the outstanding market, it's very small. So it's not a major player. Spreading risk always helps, but I mean, I'm not sure whether it will change fundamentally the dynamics of the problem, because you already have insurers, which are huge industries. They have big assets. They have institutional investors who invest in those insurers. You have reinsurers who insure essentially the insurers. So I think there is enough in the I think the fundamentals of the problem are more the dynamics which Jisung was talking about, just that the probability of these events in some geographies is rising so significantly, and if the probability rises above a certain amount, either the insurance becomes too costly for anyone to reasonably take it, or or it's just the insurer partly for that reason just doesn't want to offer it anymore. So yeah, I think of maybe this is going to be famous last words, but I think it's a little bit of a gimmick, an interesting new sort of asset, to invest in, which maybe doesn't correlate that much with other assets in people's portfolios. So then they find it interesting.
You mean the catastrophe bonds?
Yeah, the catastrophe bonds. So they are uncorrelated with other assets, sort of equities, other types of bonds. So they're interesting for investors to diversify. But I'm not sure whether it's ever going to. I don't see it as a solution to this issue with insurance.
Thanks. Next, we had more hands right here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ika. I'm a research manager from Masanga Hospital, Sierra Leone, West Africa. My question is, there's this approach that's very controversial, but also thought-provoking. It's the degrowth approach. How do you see this approach as a pathways to achieve climate resilience, reducing endless economic growth? Thank you.
Should I take a first stab at this one? I'll throw it up and you. I'll take the corner and then you. That's a great question. I won't pretend to be an expert on the theory of degrowth. I have obviously heard of it. Certainly not a new, in some ways it's not a new idea in the sense that, there's been sort of debate about ecological economics and this idea of whether or not the notion of perpetual economic growth is consistent with a sustainable environment. I think that's an age-old question. I won't pretend to have an answer to that. I will just say that personally, my read of the evidence is that there is nothing fundamental to the notion of human progress and improvement in standard of living and quality of life that is necessarily resource intensive. Let me say that another way. With the right policies and the right technology, you can imagine, it is certainly possible to imagine continued rises in quality of life, certainly within a reasonable time frame. 200 years from now, who knows what society will look like, but at least given the number of people who are currently in poverty, the number of people who are currently middle income, even the number of people in developed economies, thinking about the US, who live in conditions that I would imagine are not consistent with fully realizing their human potential, and thinking about what it would mean for there to be progress on those dimensions, I don't see I don't see enough evidence to suggest that is necessarily that you need to degrow in order to protect the environment, right? So in other words, it's possible that if you stopped economic growth that you could maybe achieve environmental goals more quickly. And it's certainly the case that if you are caring about non-human actors, right? Not non-human sentient beings, that there is an important case to be made about, okay, are we if we're giving no weight at all to, biodiversity and other animal and plant sentient beings, and you only count things that give humans more pleasure and well-being in your metrics of economic growth, then absolutely it is possible, right, that you may be crowding out other elements of what it means to be a sentient being on Earth. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't see stopping economic growth and degrowth as a necessary condition for achieving environmental sustainability, at least on the climate side of things. In other words, there doesn't seem to be enough evidence to suggest that you cannot reduce emissions while also improving standards of living. At least that's, again, what I'm familiar with. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I fully agree with Jisung. And actually, when you say there's nothing to suggest, actually, it's the opposite, right? That over the last years, emissions have been falling and GDP per capita have been rising. So actually, the evidence is the other way around, only that, again, as Jisung was explaining, emissions should be falling a bit faster. I would say degrowth is not the answer, because you're never going to get you're never going to get the support for that politically. I mean, green parties, even in Europe, have been losing support because people seem not to be willing to take costs of mitigation. Even though the benefits are much greater than the costs. So then to have a policy platform which is, we're going to make you much, much, much poorer, I don't think we'll get enough support, frankly. I just don't think that's the way. I think that we have plenty of ways to grow and decarbonize at the same time. But most of the technologies are there, at least for the next 10 years of decarbonisation, so that seems to be a smarter pathway, basically.
Yeah, and just to add, if I can add one anecdotal point to drive this home, very few of us, I don't think any of us, care about the inherent act of energy consumption. We consume energy services, right? So the light from these light bulbs, if they're coming from green or brown sources, the service that they render to us is the same. So to me, as long as you can reduce the costs of providing the same services at lower ecological footprint, which we know is possible, I don't think you need to go so far as degrowth. That's my...
Yeah, also in Europe, during this energy crisis that we've had, because of, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw even households, but also companies, take a lot of energy efficiency measures. There was a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it was incredible how much, for instance, gas consumption fell and had less impact on activity. Actually, the energy intensity of the economy fell. So there's, I fully agree. There's so much. Yeah, there's a lot of scope. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I see. Oh, well, that's not gonna. Well. The gentleman at the back has been eager right from the start.
This is a question for Jisung. I was very interested by your example of how heat drives up worker accidents in California or all over the United States, because it reframes the importance of climate adaptation as a workers' rights issue, and that then empowers, for example, unions to force employers to implement climate change adaptation. And I was wondering if there's another hidden cost, or if you were surprised by another example of a hidden cost opening a possibility for a different way of pressuring governments or employers into doing mitigation or adaptation.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Kind of going back to my earlier response to the question of if you had $1 to spend, I think what I would say is that it's unclear at the moment anyway what the right policy solution or any solution is to the problem that is outlined by the research that I described. In other words, to identify that heat has an effect on workplace injuries is different from saying, and therefore unions are the solution, or and therefore mandates are the solution, or therefore another solution. So I think just as a social scientist and economist, I would hesitate to draw conclusions about a particular category of policy response from that research. In fact, my colleagues and I are engaging in other work that examines, different policy responses and their efficacy. I think it's a really important area of inquiry and research because we will need to make these decisions, whether or not there is evidence to base them off of. But certainly to the extent that workers previously may not have been aware of these effects when they signed up for a job, it seems that at minimum, it might be an important thing for unions to do to help workers understand the risks, right? Or even employers to help workers understand the risks that they're getting into as a condition of their employment. But again, I'd hesitate to draw conclusions yet about what our research suggests in terms of what kinds of interventions are most effective.
You have a mic? Ian?
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Jisung Park, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
And, of course, to Tracy and to Nick and to the entire team. And to the team at Princeton University Press for publishing Jisung's book. And thank you for the engaging and urgent conversation. A big thank you as well to the entire team here at Pakhuis de Zwijger. We work with lots of different partners and venues throughout the city, and it is always a pleasure to be here, so thank you for your good care. And before you all head out tonight, please don't forget that our friends at Atheneum Boekhandel are here with copies of Slow Burn, just in the hallway. And Jisung will be signing books as well right after the event. So if you are a concerned citizen or if you know one, I urge you to purchase a copy of this book, take it home and ponder the contents. It is jam-packed with important information that is as informative as it is timely. Looking ahead, our next event at the John Adams Institute is with our past director, historian and author Russell Shorto, whose talk on his latest book, Taking Manhattan, is already sold out. But not to worry, you can still join the live stream on our website, or you could even catch him in person at Room for Discussion at the University of Amsterdam the day before. All of the details for the live stream will be on our John Adams website, and the information for the live event at Room for Discussion can be found on theirs. And I did check today, it's there, so you can go right now and find it out. We're also very excited after that to welcome writer, activist, and filmmaker Curtis Chin on the 8th of May with his memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. Growing up in the 1980s in Detroit, Curtis Chin came of age in a city that was struggling with urban decay, segregation, the exodus of wealth to the suburbs. But amidst the landscape of uncertainty, his family's restaurant, Chung's Cantonese Cuisine, stood as a beacon of the community, welcoming diners from all over the city and from all walks of life, from drag queens and the city's first black mayor to elderly Jewish couples and Hollywood stars. But Chung's was so much more than a restaurant. It was the beating heart of Curtis's family and really a community hub and a place for learning that launched him and many others on their careers and lives. As Curtis grappled with topics from race to sexuality and identity in Ronald Reagan's America, the bustling dining room of Chung's became his classroom, teaching him all about lessons of resilience, hard work, and the power of belonging. So if you are looking for a hopeful story in times that sometimes seem dark, please come on out on the 8th of May to hear Curtis Chin. In my opinion, another event not to be missed. And if you're looking for more John Adams content, you can scan the QR codes up behind me. You could listen to our podcast. You could visit our website. You could even sign up for our newsletter. You could become a member, a sponsor, or a donor and support the work that we do. The John Adams Institute is proudly independent. We are supported financially and socially by and for the people in this room that are here with us, not by any governments. And we are proud of that. So please join us for the ride and help us to continue the work that we do. And we're looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks again to everyone tonight, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.